My name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Stephen Westby, and we're at Witness Tree Vineyard in Salem. It's May 19th, 2021. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
First question, biggest question, why wine?
Well, interesting, and I'll try to make this not as long-winded as it can be. I grew up in a household where my father was an early adopter of California wine, so it was always kind of around the house, and I was intrigued by the concept. I was that kid that used to read the encyclopedia for fun, and so he had a couple of books that I would leaf through, and it's like, oh, that's fun, that's interesting, etc., etc. When I went off to school, I went to a small private college in Northfield, Minnesota called St. Olaf, not very much unlike Linfield in size and scope. It's best known for its music programs, but it also, quite frankly, is kind of a doctor factory. The science program is very, very strong, and I was a biology major. And most of the folks that were in my little cadre are now doctors, dentists. My college roommate's a vet. There's a couple of rogue lawyers in there. But for better or for worse, I cannot do blood at all. So I was a plant guy. And my junior year, I did a research project on the grapevine for my plant morphology class, and I thought, this is such a cool plant. And of course it was college, so there was other research. But when I graduated, my wife and I got married that summer, but she was finishing up her nursing degree in the Twin Cities, so we knew no matter what, that first year we were going to be in the Twin Cities and I was going to be doing something. I had no idea what that something was going to be, and quite frankly, the job market was not terribly strong. But there was a local wine shop that was looking for somebody on their sales floor. And I thought, oh, I like wine. I can do this. And so I started selling wine, did that for about a year and a half. After that, my wife and I decided we're young, married, no kids, and we took 6 months and just did the backpack thing through Europe. And my special mission was to visit as many wine regions as we could along the way. And in fact, we were supposed to do harvest in Bordeaux that year. But it turned out that 1985, now we're speaking, was an exceptionally late vintage. And we were truly doing the Europe on $25 a day deal. And we were coming up as late September, kind of looking into the coin purse, and you're kind of going, And we'd call the chateau and say, is it time? Call us in a week. A week later, is it time? Call us in a week. And we finally looked at each other and said, we're tired. We're ready to just go home. And so we took basically the last few funds that we had, bought our plane tickets, and flew home. So I'm firmly convinced that if I had worked that harvest, I would have been in the industry that much sooner, but instead got back to the Twin Cities, needed a job, and I got a job at the rival store in the Twin Cities to the company I'd been working for prior, and ultimately was at that shop for 10 years. Became their wine buyer, had a chance to just see the world of wine from a whole new perspective, and as the buyer, we got to see some really interesting things. And this is where we fast forward to how we got here. Sonia's, my wife's father, and her cousin Carolyn, even though they were cousins, Jimmy, my father-in-law, grew up in Carolyn's household for all practical purposes. His father passed away when he was 1, and his mother was not in a position to really deal with it by herself. And so he grew up on Carolyn's family farm. Carolyn's husband, Dennis, was another early adopter of California wine, and we'd be at family gatherings, and he'd look at me and he'd say, Steve, when I retire, we should do a winery. And I always thought, sounds like a plan. Have another glass. And finally, it was Thanksgiving in '92. I get a phone call from Dennis, and he says on the phone, Stephen, it's time to go find a winery. Where do you want to go? And after I picked the phone back up off the floor, I kind of said, well, Dennis, I'm starting to see some pretty exciting things coming out of Oregon. It was very early ground floor stuff. And Dennis did very well for himself. He ended up as director of clinical research for Bristol Myers Squibb, but I knew that we weren't going to be going to Napa and buying $100,000 an acre dirt. And quite frankly, most importantly, I thought I could sell my wife on Oregon because there's no way in heck she was moving to California. So anyway, Dennis and I made several trips out to wine country here in the early 90s. And in the spring of 94, the Witness Tree property was up for sale. It was in vines. They had made a few vintages. And, quite frankly, I don't really know those wines. But the fellow who developed the property, he was an airline pilot for, I want to say it was American Airlines. He was being transferred back to the East Coast. His third wife was divorcing him, and all of a sudden owning winery property in Oregon was not part of his program. And so we kind of looked around, and I looked at Dennis and said, I think this is it. And so the ink went dry on the deal in August of 94, and by the spring of 95, Dennis and Carolyn had moved out from the Philadelphia area. My wife and our 3 then very small children drove out and moved out to here, and we hired a Davis-trained winemaker named Bryce Bagnall to do the vineyard management and the winemaking, because you had to have somebody that knew what they were doing. You can read all about it in the book, but until somebody shows you how to hook that hose to that pump, sorry, they're the practical aspects. And so I worked as Bryce's cellar master for 9 years. And then because I had the marketing side of the business already kind of in hand, I did all the sales and marketing as well. That said, Bryce fell ill in the early 2000s, and by 2004 he was no longer able to keep going. He was my age, but ALS is a cruel disease. And so at that point I took over the winemaking and the vineyard management. We hired another fellow to do the sales and marketing for us, and kind of ever since. To kind of sum it all up, we sold the property a few years ago to an investor out of Portland, and so they've bought our vineyard. They've replanted a ton of stuff. As you can see, there's all kinds of young vines out there, and I think they're going to be doing some pretty special stuff here. And in fact, interestingly enough, I'm going to be buying some fruit out of this vineyard this year for my wife, and I have a side project that we call Elemental Cellars on a much smaller scale with purchased fruit from growers that we know and respect. And so we did this in 2016 because when we sold the vineyard, it was in August. And so I had actually farmed that crop. And the people that bought it from us said, well, if you want to take any of this back out of this lower field, go right ahead. And so I took a fair bit of, what I knew was the sweet spots. My daughter bought a little bit of fruit. My cellar master bought a little bit of fruit. And so there's what I'm going to continue to call the legacy bottlings going forward.
Got to be an interesting experience buying back grapes that you tended for so long, I imagine.
Yeah, at least I knew it had been farmed well.
All right, so I want to back up a second. You mentioned kind of learning wine from the retail side of things. Tell me about learning wine, developing a palate, learning wine, and also learning how to buy wine for a wine shop. How did those educations happen for you?
Well, so initially I was on the sales floor, but it was a team effort, and so every Friday, the distributors around the city that we worked with would drop samples off of new items. And so as a collective group, there were usually 4 of us plus the fellow that I learned the business side of it from, the wine buyer who preceded me. You taste through, and it was a chance to have the world come to you. And we did a lot of direct importing, because the store I work for, quite frankly, it's a fire breather. They sell a load of wine. We did a lot of direct importing, working with importers like Terry Thies with German wines, any number of growers. For example, we directly imported the Gigal portfolio out of the Rhone, this and that and the other. And by virtue of that, you kind of sidestepped the distribution network in a sense, so we were able to offer these wines at great pricing without the middleman. And so by virtue of that, we were tasting, let's call it 50, 60 wines a week from all over. And so it was just experience.
With a store like that, how often were you discovering new wines? How often were you discovering new regions?
As things came along, you obviously had the old standards, Bordeaux, Burgundy, Champagne, et cetera, et cetera. But, let's face it, the world of wine has changed quite a bit. Australia was hardly a blip on the map. We're talking, 35 years ago, as far as what we knew. So that all became new stuff. New Zealand, again, yes, of course, they knew they were there, but we didn't know that these wines existed. And all of a sudden they started showing up, and you had some intrepid importers that were willing to take chances rather than going kind of the safe and sound route.
Tell me about your consumers at that time. Well, what was the level of wine education and wine desire knowledge from the people you were selling wine to?
Boy, this is a tricky question. When I was first getting going in this, let's put it this way. You had some people that really understood fine wine, but that was a very narrow niche. One of the stories I like to refer to, there was a very big trend in the mid 80s to the early 90s, and there was white Zinfandel, for example. And I remember one time I had a customer come up to me and said, "Where do you keep your white imbecile?" And I didn't say it, but I thought, you're standing right in front of me. And, the whole wine cooler thing was also huge. That's gone away now. And, just plug in White Claw. It's sort of the same concept. It's, sort of sweet, fizzy, and, but it's terrible analogy, but they're the gateway wines. And so people, as they become more adventurous and they're not afraid to try different things, that's why our staff was so important, because you could steer them. You could say, okay, what do you like? And then they tell you this, and you say, you know what? We just got this in. You might want to try it. And you just sort of expand people's horizons that way.
Tell me about your sort of like selling or retail philosophy. What were the most successful ways of selling wine to people and turning them on to new things?
Well, so much about, wine is, it's like, well, what are you having for dinner? It's simple opening questions. Well, we're doing this. You know what? I think you should try this. Do you like, bigger, bolder reds, or do you like, lighter, crisper whites? You kind of let them tell you what they like, and then you can kind of steer them, and hopefully in new directions. And of course, the goal is always to upsell them a little bit. What's your price range? And then you swing for the fences a little bit. And more often than not, if you sell it right, they'll take it.
So you mentioned that one of the reasons you came to Oregon was you'd had some Oregon wines that you were excited about. Tell me about your before you got here, your sort of initial impression of Oregon wine. What had you tried, and what excited you about it?
Well, let me tell you, there was one wine that in particular was the aha. This is something. Because let's face it, the folks that were here first, and God bless them, they were carving out a niche they were out here in the wilderness, because people just didn't understand that. Well, let's face it, there certainly wasn't what we see today. But there was a fellow by the name of Tom Kime. He was an importer, or not an importer, but had a small wine distributorship. And he was working with a guy by the name of John Thomas, who still makes wine here. For the first couple of years that John Thomas had wine, and he's still up in the Dundee Hills, he makes 400 or 500 cases a year done. It may have expanded a little bit. I think he's got 4 acres or something like that. I was buying a third of his production a year for our store. And initially he had, off of his youngest vines, he had an entry level that was called Acme. And I think it sold for like $11.99 or something like that. It was very inexpensive. And the Thomas was maybe $20. But it was the 1988 Thomas, and it's just like, holy cow, there's something happening here.
So once you got here, tell me about, as you started to meet the people, as you started to drink the other wines, tell me about, again, this sort of initial impressions. What did Oregon wine look like to you at that time? Well,
you got to remember, this again was, we got here what I would call sort of on the second floor. The Bethel Heights and the, Christum was just getting going at the same time we got here. In the neighborhood, Evesham Wood was kind of up and going, Adelsheim and Myron up at Amity, and, the people that were kind of the founders, if you will, they had carved it out. And one of the things that was, which is, something I think that still exists today, they realized that if they didn't work together, this wasn't going to fly. Because there's, out here, everybody was sharing information with the people. They were sharing equipment. They were sharing ideas, sharing crews. That's what got it going. And that spirit of camaraderie, existed and just built our industry. You think about things like IPNC or the Oregon Pinot Camp or things like that. That was a community effort to get those things going. And I think it's so interesting. It used to be when I first was out there trying to market these wines, people look at you and go, Oregon, I didn't know they made wine there. And then, you fast forward about 15, 20 years and they go, how do I get into Pinot Camp? So things have changed dramatically. And of course, so has the profile. Now we have our own section in the Wine Spectator, for example. And of course, the world has taken notice. There is, the industry has changed in that regard, because now, instead of sort of bootstraps and shoestrings, there's significant investment coming in from all over.
So you said you had looked at a couple places around here. What drew you to this location? Why did you choose this to be the site you wanted to invest in?
It was more about, we looked at this piece of dirt and that piece of dirt, and, this was a potential B&B. And this was just a vineyard, or this was just a winery. This was the full meal deal. It had an existing vineyard that was, not all of it was in production at that point. The lower 30 acres were in production. In 95, our first vintage here, the middle vineyard came online with about 16 acres. And, it felt right. Truly the diamond in the rough kind of thing. You could see the potential, and, we ran with it. Unfortunately, Bryce knew what he was doing. Excellent teacher, and so I learned my skill from him. And as far as he didn't know vineyard. He had worked 9 years down at Edna Valley Vineyard after graduating from San Luis or UC Davis, and then did a year in Burgundy on a Rotary scholarship, and all up and down the Côte de Nuit and the Côte de Beaune, tasting in cellars, learning from these producers, and then worked the 93 harvest with Denis Mortet and Gevrey Chambertin. And during his time there, he met Mike Etzel. Etzel was over there on a trip, and they hit it off. And so Bryce had made arrangements. He worked the 94 crush with Mike at Beaufrere. And then, of course, was looking for a gig, and we were looking for a winemaker, and so it all kind of fell into place.
What about him? Why him? Why was he the right fit?
Just, he had the right attitude. He wanted to learn. He didn't feel like he knew it all. And so, for example, as far as the vineyard work, the next door at Christum, the vineyard manager was a fellow named Mark Feltz. And so we had Mark as kind of our consultant to kind of coach us up on how to do the vineyard and that sort of thing. And, it was literally, learned by doing. I spent many of those early years on a tractor seat, and it's amazing the things you can discover. But, so ultimately we had a full-time crew of 4 guys. Occasionally we'd bring in, contract labor certainly for harvest. And, when you needed to get things done now. But in general, with 4 full-time fellows, we were able to manage 52 acres of vineyard.
You mentioned that a lot of your early role was kind of working with Bryce, learning from him. Tell me about your initial impressions of the work of winemaking.
This is one of those things when you're too young and naive that you don't realize how flippin' hard it is. I was having a ball. 95 was that was our first vintage. Beautiful summer. It's like, this place is paradise. And all of a sudden harvest happened, and the rain came, and it didn't stop. And the setup, we have buildings that are here now that were not constructed at the time. We had this old pole barn and that type of thing. We didn't have room for much of that equipment to be inside, covered. And so we're out there processing in the rain. We weren't smart enough to even put up a tent, but it was fun. You spend 16-hour days and get up and do it again the next day. Then the second year, we actually at least bought a 10x10 tent to cover the press. Ultimately, the circus would come to town every fall, and we had a 30x40 out on the crush pad. But a lot of trial and error.
It's beyond that in terms of sort of developing the skills. How did that kind of evolve for you? At what point did you feel kind of comfortable in the process of winemaking, the annual process of winemaking?
Well, it's one of those things you have to be open to the idea of new things. And because I at least had a science background and some very, very rusty chemistry, I had the basic concepts. So at least as far as the book side of things, that's one thing. But this is where I think my tasting experience from my prior, retail helps out, because you have to know what you're looking for in the wine, and especially when it's rough and in the barrel, you don't necessarily know what you've got. But the one thing that I've always felt certain of is winemaking is done in the vineyard. You have to grow good fruit, and so managing yield, paying attention, making sure you don't have diseased, compromised fruit coming in. I've always said you can make bad wine from great fruit, but you can't make great wine from bad fruit. And so my mantra was always, make it out there, and then in the winery, you're like the midwife, just don't drop the baby. If there's a problem, you work on that, but in general, just get the heck out of the way.
So with that, kind of as that philosophy develops, where the vineyard is sort of your main focus, tell me about determining how you wanted to farm and how to know what you were looking for in terms of problems and in terms of solutions, I guess. Well,
we were live certified. We never went the full organic route. On paper, I love it. In practical, it's really hard and very expensive. And quite frankly, because we truly were a shoestring operation, I hate to say it, but Roundup is cheap and effective. That was pretty much my one sin, if you will.
And so as you work in the vineyard more, tell me about, again, how do you learn a vineyard? How do you know what you're looking for, and how do you kind of handle the size and the scope of it?
Well, this was really part of the interesting thing. Most of our fermenters were these 1.5-ton macro bins, or the 4x4 wood with the plastic sleeve. We had a few larger fermenters, but in general, when we would harvest, you'd harvest blocks, and then you kept those separate within these fermentations. So over time, when you barrel this down, you'd barrel each lot separately, and so you had a chance to go back and revisit and taste and start to learn what that block is going to do and what that guy's going to bring you, and that one's going to get declassified. They're just you learn the vineyard from just tasting as much as anything. I mean, very early on the far side of this lower field, there was a section, and it's you can maybe take a picture of it later, but this lower field is a very slow descent, if I'm looking for the wrong word there. Decline. And on Missoula flood soils. But on that far side of the field, there's all of a sudden this area that pops straight south. And it's a slightly transitional soil type. It's got some Missoula flood in there, but there's some of the washed down Jory and Nicaea that's come over it. In fact, years and years back, we we'd dig trenches and just go looking to see what we got. And we brought somebody out and he looked at that and he says, that one's not in the books. And so between the aspect and then the soil, because of that, the lower field, anytime, especially as you're heading into final ripening, as the sun would be setting in the evenings, the lower field would be cast into shadow, except for that little section that was popped to the south. And it would see 20 to 30 extra minutes of sunlight every given evening during that final ripening stage, and it just gave it something special. We dubbed that the benchmark block, because a benchmark, surveyor's term, is the standard by which all others are judged. And I should probably throw in our Witness Tree story here too. The tree itself was used as a surveyor's landmark back in 1854. And so when the Oregon Trail was running, the pioneers were coming across the country in their covered wagons. When they got to Oregon and picked their land claim, they had to have boundaries so that people knew whose was whose. And so surveyors were sent out, and in that time frame, they weren't putting stakes in the ground like they would now, but rather they would mark rocks, they would mark trees. Because these objects bear witness to the boundary, it's a witness marker, or in our instance, because it bears witness to the northwest corner of donation land claim number 51, it is a witness tree. And our running joke was always, we take really good care of the tree because we don't want to change the name of the winery to Witness Stump.
Witness trunk, yeah.
Stump.
That's bad, yeah. I like it. So I'm curious, as a similar question I asked you about your consumers in Minnesota. Tell me about Oregon wine consumers when you were getting started in the 90s.
Well, again, it was so interesting. This particular vineyard, and many like it that were planted in that time frame, this was planted initially in 82. The banks were looking at these guys saying, you're nuts already. But yeah, you can try that Pinot thing. But you've got to have a cash crop. You have to plant Chardonnay.
Mm-hmm.
And the clones that were available were not well suited to the Oregon climate. Mm-hmm. Primarily, this was planted to the the 108 clone.
Mm-hmm.
Very late ripening. It wants to crop like crazy, and high acid, et cetera, et cetera. And these are all things that are not really what we needed here in Oregon. So now, of course, the Dijon clones have become much more valuable. But so the 108 clone of Chardonnay, I always thought was beautiful, but it was always the last things that we would pick, and it would be, sometimes you're almost bumping up on, like late October, early November, and the wines were always very bright and, call it perky. But of course, the marketplace at the time, all they were looking for was the big butterballs. Think of like Rombauer or something like that. They were all, oak and butter, and quite frankly, I couldn't give it away. We had an entry level, we had two tiers. You had the Witness Tree label, and then we had our second label that we called Aurora. And we were selling that for, to the wholesale network, I was selling it for $48 a case. Because it's just try and cover it, what we put into it. It was definitely a loss leader. So we, by virtue of that recognition, we realized we got way too much Chardonnay, not nearly enough Pinot Noir. And so, of course, the correct way to transition a vineyard is to do what the folks that bought it from us are doing. Yes, there was phylloxera. We didn't have that kind of budget. And nor did we have the time frame of being able to rip everything out, replant, and then wait 7 years before you have a full crop. And so we did a lot of what's called top grafting. And so we would take 4-acre chunks at a time. In the spring of any given year in the late 90s and early 2000s, we'd bring a crew up from California, and this happened in many of the neighboring vineyards as well. We would have collected budwood for the grafting. And the first thing you do, just as the sap starting to rise in the plant, is you go out with a chainsaw, lop the head of the vine off, and then the grafting crew would come in and with very sharp knives and very precise cuts, graft 2 sticks onto that trunk, wrap it up with some tape and paint on a little something called Henry's Tree Cure, and then walk on. And the way these guys moved, I was literally running with a chainsaw to get from vine to vine to vine just to stay ahead of these guys. But, that first year, you don't get the crop. It does leaf out. It does actually set fruit, but it's so delayed that it doesn't get ripe here. Down in California, it's my understanding that you can actually top graft and harvest the same year and not miss a beat. But for us, at least that next year, because you went in on an established root system, you had a full crop, boom, done. And so we gradually transitioned this vineyard, which at the time was 46 acres, over half of which was Chardonnay. Ultimately got that whittled down to, I had 2 acres of Chardonnay, we grafted 2 acres of Viognier and 2 acres of Pinot Blanc in there, a half acre of Dolcetto, and then everything else was Pinot. And then of course we were planting new vineyard, especially in the early 2000s going forward, where we would do our own bench grafting. Once the vineyard was all pruned and tied down, I had my guys kind of looking at me going, well, what do we do now? And a fellow by the name of Lowell Ford, who has Illahee Vineyard, he had a couple of grafting machines, and so he schooled us up on how to do it. And so we had our own nursery, and I built a greenhouse, and each spring we would make about 6,000 new baby plants, nursery them for a year, and then plant them out, new field up across the top of the vineyard. The first year everything was always a learning experiment. We had no way to water these plants. And so we hauled a couple of our 3,000-gallon wine tanks up to the top of the hill, filled it 300 gallons at a time using the spray rig. And then my son, for his high school job, he and a couple of buddies would drag hoses all through these vineyards, watering each plant one at a time. all summer long to keep them going. So we ultimately came to the solution that was better. We would nursery for 2 years, so you had a little bigger root system before you put them in the ground, and then we got to stop the watering. But you learn by doing.
It's incredible. You talked earlier about kind of the vineyard and winemaking relationship for you, and how the winemaking for you was kind of getting out of the way. And I'm curious, as you were taking over from Bryce and starting to kind of do more of the work on your own, how did that philosophy develop for you? In the early years, did you want to over tinker and then have to pull back? Or?
No. Bryce's philosophy was very much kind of in line with where I was going, and so there was no big transition. He had his experience at Edna Valley, and this is back when Edna Valley was still part of the Salem group, and things have obviously changed dramatically in that regard down in California, where the big vibrators have gobbled up so many of what were the stellar operations of the day. And so, he had a very good handle on what to do and what not to do. And I kind of went with that. We never, like I say, we never went organic, but everything but.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And tell me about the wines. You mentioned kind of some of the things you were growing here. Tell me about the wines you're producing. What made them Witness Tree? What was unique?
Well, let's face it, dirt counts, okay? But the other part of it is yield. If you overcrop, you're never going to make great wine. So we took it with the approach that we're going to keep yields low. Our 2 tons to the acre was pretty much our mantra. Sometimes Mother Nature would give you a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less. But we would be very aggressive in our thinning. And you're sitting there, you're doing this, and you're going, there's money on the ground, there's money on the ground, there's money on the ground. But that way, you had wines with depth and character. And that's what I was seeking. I wanted to make something that had a statement as opposed to, it's kind of Pinot.
And for the site, you talked about the kind of the benchmark spot. What else is unique about Witness Tree? What else is unique about the terroir from your perspective?
Well, okay, so the lower field, the 30 acres here in the elevations, the property starts at about 250 feet and tops out at about 800. Once you transition past about 300 and 350 feet, now you're getting into ancient volcanic soils, Nicaea and Jory. And here in the Amity Hills is pretty much, as my understanding, the only place you find real Nicaea. Yes, there's some Jory, but the Nicaea is much shallower. And there are variants of it. But by virtue of that shallow soil, the vine has to really go mining for water. And so it's punching down deep, deep, deep to get that nutrient. And of course, by virtue of that, it's also bringing up other things that make the wines more complex. And so once you get up above that bathtub ring, as Ted Castile refers to it, I'm assuming in the archives people have talked about the Missoula floods. So you get out of the Missoula flood soils into the ancient volcanic, the profile of the wine changes dramatically. Missoula flood soils tend to be a little softer, a little less, more brighter fruit, if you will. Once you get into the Nicaea in particular, now you're getting into earth and spice and just a little bit more complexity. Mm-hmm. And again, this kind of comes back to the whole thing. Earlier in our series here, we were laying on a little bit more wood because that was kind of like what the market was asking for. But over time, I've really backed off the oak profile. Let the wine show. A little spice from some new oak, but you don't find a whole lot of new wood in the cellar anymore. Maybe 25%.
So tell me about the growth of Witness Tree and again of making more wine and finding more people to buy it. How did you sell your wine, and how did that kind of evolve over time?
Well, this was one of the things that so our partners in this operation, Dennis and Carolyn Devine, I mentioned them earlier, older couple, and Dennis was very strongly firm in the idea of we're going to grow our own fruit. We're not going to go out outsourcing. And so by virtue of that, we were limited in our expansion by what I was able to put new in the ground. Mm-hmm. And so we ultimately, I think when we started here, because it was a lot more Chardonnay, we were about 5,000 cases. I ultimately grew it up to 6 to 7, depending on the vintage. But this is one of these, without getting, I'm trying to think of the best way to put this. When 2007 happened, everything changed. We had our best year ever in 2006. We were, able to raise prices without getting ridiculous. And this is also one of my little things. My retail experience tells me, it's great that you can sell your bottle of wine for $100 on the retail shelf, but that one guy that buys that one bottle, that's great. I want to sell cases. So we always kept our pricing, what I consider reasonable. Our top tier reserve wines were about $50 retail. And those were what I call the Uber reserves. We make 100 cases each of them. We had our reserve tier we called Vintage Select, and that was 400 to 500 cases a year, retail roughly 40. And then our main Witness Tree label was about a $30 retail. Great value. During those years when we were doing the grafting, those were referred to as the chainsaw blocks. And we started making a little side retail only wine that we called the chainsaw. $20 retail out the front door, 300 to 400 cases a year. And, by virtue of it being retail, it was the same as selling it to a distributor, in North Carolina. You got the same money. When 2007 happened and the bottom fell out of everything, all of a sudden it's like, holy man, we're not selling any wine. And so chainsaw became a very big part of our program. And so we made more and more and more under that label, and it was coming from sections of the vineyard that wasn't necessarily chainsaw. It was higher quality, stuff that should have been, higher caliber. And it kept the doors on, doors open and the lights on. But the market said, hey, this stuff's really good and it's cheap. And so we kind of created a monster for ourselves by virtue of, it's like, unintended consequences. It's like, no, really, you want to buy that one? They said, no, this is too good. So anyway, that's here and there. But it's another, it became an avenue, for example, in 2013, which was a terrible rain vintage. I declassified almost everything as chainsaw because, I just wasn't willing to sell wine and try to pretend that it was worthy of a higher price. And again, sort of shooting yourself in the foot. People say, oh, it's really good wine for $20 or whatever it was. And so, it's, fits and starts. You'll learn as you go.
So I'm curious how, especially local retail DTC Oregon consumers changed at Witness Tree over the years. What were the original customers like when you were trying to sell wine locally, and how did their expectations, knowledge, demands change as you grew?
Well, in the early years, it was kind of the accidental tourist. There weren't that many of us out here, and so if people were coming out wine tasting, the game plan was, I'm speaking from the consumer's point of view, they'd hit 4 or 5 wineries and taste here, taste there, and kind of move. What I've seen transition and happen is, especially as wineries have really kind of grown up their tasting room ambiance, they become more destination type of things where people will, they'll come and they'll kind of, this is where I'm spending my day. And so it's really transitioned kind of how that customer, what they're looking for. And then let's face it, the last year has been had its own set of challenges. We're just now starting to see some of the tasting room business come back because it truly is tourism driven. This past winter, of course, we could be open outside, but if it's raining sideways and it's 35 degrees, you just aren't going to see people. So at least most recently, FedEx has truly kept our doors open. I joke about being winemaker and vineyard manager for 25 years, and the last year I've been the shipping department. But you do what you got to.
So you mentioned earlier that you had sold. Tell me about the decision to sell and what you were looking for and then sort of the next generation of Witness Tree and what you wanted your role to be.
Well, so when Dennis passed away some years ago, probably it was in 2013, And Carolyn's health had become a little bit, let's just say, iffy. So the decision was made to sell the property. I wasn't thrilled by the idea, but my wife and I had a minority stake, and we weren't personally in a position to be able to say to Carolyn, hey, we'll write you the check. And so when the decision was made and the property sold, the way that deal was structured, the inventory was not part of the sale. So dirt, buildings, yes, wine, no. And so all of a sudden I really had to put on my sales hat and get out there and try and sell wine. My wife, I think I mentioned earlier on, and I have had a little project called Elemental Cellars that we've done through the years, even from when the kids were little, with purchased fruit on a very limited scale. When the kids were little, it was the college fund. And then they became older and it became the student loan repayment fund. Now that I'm older, it's the retirement fund. So we're hoping to, at this point, grow it up to about 2,000 cases a year and be done. You know, because at that level, I don't have to work so hard. I don't need to have employees to help me out as far as, you know, that kind of workload, you know, and except for manage, you know, a little harvest help and some bottling, I can manage that myself, and I, you know, continue to sell in the markets that I choose to, as opposed to the markets that I have to. You know, road work is hard. It's, you know, not it can be fun, but it's not necessarily so. And so I'd rather visit markets where I have family and friends, and, you know, service them and have it be kind of a, you know, busman's holiday, so to speak.
So you mentioned 2020 and sort of the effects it had on. Tell me about your kind of the initial reaction to the pandemic last year for you and for the business, and how you're kind of coming out of it now on this end.
Well, it's, you know, like many in our industry, so much of our business was restaurant driven. And so when the pandemic hit in full force, that just stopped. And that's where I come back to the whole FedEx idea. People didn't stop drinking wine, but they were ordering it online or you know, picking up the phone, et cetera, et cetera. And so, you know, that's how we finished selling through the remaining Witness Tree wines. There was a slight hiccup 2 years ago in my world. I broke my back. And so really it's been kind of a 2-year hiatus as far as me personally, but now we're kind of on the back, coming out of that. And, you know, so all of a sudden my distributors that we're going to continue working with are starting to, you know, perk up. For example, I was in Minnesota this last week and paid a call to the store I used to buy for. They've got the retail exclusive in the Twin Cities, so we've got wine going there. Certain markets that, you know, Alabama, which is shockingly a huge market for Oregon wine, period. We do really well there. Colorado. You know, I'm trying to figure out California. Our distributor there was bought up by one of the giant ones, and so all of a sudden, you know, a small property or small label in Oregon isn't part of their plan. But Arizona, Nebraska, the distributors that we worked with, you know, very hand in glove, we're going to continue to do so.
So you talked about your kind of early impressions of Oregon wine and kind of your few and far between neighbors in the early days. Obviously, that's changed quite a bit. Tell me about, let's start with just the immediate area. Tell me about how the Eola Amity Hills has grown up since you've been here and the changes to it.
Oh, it's enormous. Not only just planting, you know, obviously the number of wineries has grown dramatically, but just the scale of the vineyards that are in the ground. You know, when we first got here, Bethel Heights, Kristen was fairly new. Just thinking Temperance Hill up above us was there. You know, Evesham Wood closer to town. Seven Springs, which now feeds the Evening Land Project. You know, et cetera. I mean, Myron at Amity, there were vineyards, and then most of them were smaller growers that would sell to the existing wineries. And now, goodness sakes, it's crazy. You know, obviously Domaine Serene has their Jerusalem Hill property here. You know, Christum has expanded dramatically. You know, it's just, the difference is incredible. You know, just the loop here, you know, us, Christum. Go around the corner, Zenith Vineyard. And up from them, Bethel Heights. You've got Walter Scott. Go a little further, there's Bryn Mawr. Then you go around a little further and you've got Bjornson. And, you know, it's just amazing. And that's just a little 9-mile loop.
And what about for the Oregon industry in general? What are the biggest changes you've seen as a part of the industry?
Well, I mean, just as far as how it's maturing. I won't call it a mature industry yet, but I would guess we're pretty ding-dang close. But just the investment that's come in, you know, the fact that people are willing now to just say, yep, they figured it out. And so people aren't afraid to just make major league investments, and you know, from all over. You know, it was recently in the news. I mean, Bollinger Champagne just bought Ponzi. You know, talk about one of the original old guards. You know, that's pretty big affirmation for the fact that our industry is. Yeah, I guess they know what they're doing there in Oregon.
You talked about the collaborative aspect, the collegial aspect of the industry from its inception, from the early days. With the growth, does it still feel that way to you? Does it still feel like a collegial place?
You know, it kind of depends on, I mean, because there are so many new players, there are so many players I don't know personally. So I can't speak necessarily to that on a big scale, but certainly within the people that I've known and worked with and, you know, been, you know, collaborative with through the years, we still continue to do so. I've not been involved in Pinot Camp for a number of years, but, you know, through the years I was very much involved in IPNC. I was on that board for 6 years, was on the OPC board for 6 years. I actually recently reached out to Amy Wesselman, the director of IPNC, and said, Amy, it's time for me to get, you know, back in the water here. And so once we're allowed to actually have such an event again, I'm hoping to, you know, get back involved and, you know, at that point, you know, kind of get back in the swing.
There's a lot of experience on those boards. Tell me, you mentioned obviously kind of the kind of purpose of IPNC and OPC, but from your perspective, serving on the boards, what were the biggest achievements? What were the biggest accomplishments while you were serving?
Well, I kind of alluded earlier, it was, you know, just the raising the profile and the awareness of our industry. You know, OPC in particular it was a dangerous thing actually, because you'd bring these buyers and, you know, players from DC or California or Minnesota or wherever have you, you'd bring them out here, they'd see this place and they go, oh my God, and they'd quit their job that you brought them out here to try and sell your wine and became part of our industry. I used to joke that we had to make them sign a contract. They had to go back and at least sell the wine for about 3 years before they moved back here. But you know, it's a great thing.
So as you look ahead for Oregon wine, all the changes you've seen, what does it look like in the upcoming years? What is the industry going to look like?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and I know that Greg Jones is now part of your program. Many years ago, I remember being at a talk. He was still at Southern Oregon University, and was talking about climate change. And of course, you know, without stepping on political toes, there are still people that don't want to believe it, but things are changing, period. And at that talk, he was saying, you know, by 2050, the Willamette Valley, well, he started with Napa and Sonoma will be too hot to grow anything but port varieties. And he said the Willamette Valley is going to be Cabernet, Merlot, you know, bigger red Rhone varieties, that type of thing, because it's going to be so warm. You know, we used to talk about being cool climate. We ain't cool climate anymore. And he said, unless you're north facing or at 1,000 feet and above, you know, then you might still be able to do Pinot. Pinot's going to be up in the Okanagan. You know, it's just, that's the reality. So I think we have to kind of, and people are starting to, I shouldn't say embracing, but I think people realize that's true. You start hearing more and more about people putting Tempranillo in the ground and, you know, trying some of these varieties that, you know, 25 years ago, people would have looked at it and said, you're nuts, you know, and now it's like, God, I wish I'd done that.
So as that, if those changes kind of take that route, the expected route, how does Oregon evolve and adapt? Can Oregon evolve and adapt beyond being the Pinot place and into something else?
Well, it certainly needs to.
Again, let's bring it back to California. Now, we had our own deal with the wildfires this past summer, but California's, it's going to change. It's changed. You know, they're going to continue to make wine down there, but they're going to have to change their game plan too. But as far as anything new going in the ground here, yeah, you probably, if you're at elevation, you should still be thinking Pinot. But if you're looking for a long-term project, you've got to be thinking ahead.
So you've talked a little bit about what the future looks like for you with your other label. Anything else you're looking forward to, other projects or things on the horizon for yourself?
Well, as I mentioned, we're kind of downscaling things. Had a chance to visit my first grandbaby last week, and so my wife and I are both 60, and so I figure I've got another 10 to 15 years in me that, you know, I should be able to handle the work. I look at people like Mark Vlasic, who's, you know, I think he's 69, something like that, and he's just going strong. You know, you look at your role models, and, you know, there's no reason to, you know, back down, or at least, you know, quit altogether. It's too much fun.
So if someone were to come to you and ask for your words of wisdom on joining the wine industry, what would you tell them?
Well, again, things have transitioned a lot as far as how things go, but the running joke forever has been, if you want to have a small fortune in the wine industry, start with the large one and buy a winery, and pretty soon you're going to have a small fortune. Well, the capital investment is huge, let's face it. I mean, you put so much up front before you ever see, you know, a nickel come back to you. So you've got to be able to figure out a way to, you know, finance it. That's the greatest challenge, I think.
All right, that's all the questions that I have for you today, Stephen. Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything we didn't cover that we should have covered?
No, I think we kind of went around the block there.
Well, thank you so much for your time, for your hospitality of this space, and your great stories and thoughts here. And we'll go ahead and let you off the hook.
All right.